Today we have two very qualified experts. Michel Wyss, who is the lecturer in strategic studies at the Military Academy of the Swiss Armed Forces, and Richard Machnikowski, is a professor from the University of Lodz, who is the expert on international relations and terrorism in his country, Poland. And today we have a few subjects to discuss, and I would like to stress the complicated situation that, in my opinion, is getting worse with the days coming by. Just recently, I've checked that Israeli Ministry of Defense, Gallant, said that his country still will retaliate in response to October 1st attack by Tehran, and quote, so that the world understands our strengths. Just recently, the Russians had hosted their BRICS Plus summit in Kazan, and there was the Egyptian leader Sisi as well there. And Putin was also quite critical about the Middle East, and he said that the situation is deteriorating, etc. What I mean here, and also not to forget that 3 days ago precisely, Iran arrested a group of Israeli citizens on spying allegations, and 2 days ago, Israel also arrested Iranian spies. So the situation is quite complicated. Both countries exchange of compliments. So I would like actually to start with you, Michel. And how could you describe the current geopolitical climate, in generally speaking, in the Middle East, and especially with regard to the Hamas-Israel war and the war and the Israeli operation in Lebanon, and the bigger conflict that is basically ongoing, albeit not frontally, between Iran and Israel? The floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks a lot for having me, and I look forward to this discussion. So I think if you want to use one word, then it's really messy. That's what's going on right now. It's actually quite interesting when you think about it. A little more than a year ago, you had U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who was at the Atlantic Monthly Festival. And you probably know where I'm going with this right now, but right, he was there on the festival and he said, you know, the Middle East region nowadays is quieter than it's been in 20 years, or basically ever since 9/11. And then it took basically 8 days for Hamas to completely wreck this assessment. And yeah, I mean, it's very obvious that you had I think he wasn't wrong about it. Obviously, there were still a lot of tensions in Iraq. You still had fighting in Syria going on. It's kind of interesting. We don't really talk about Syria anymore these days. Obviously, the situation in Yemen is complicated. All of that was already building or forming the background, so to speak. But then, of course, the Hamas attack on October 7 really plunged the whole entire region into something else. And I mean, a lot of people obviously warned about it, that there would be spillover effects, like it's usually the case with such wars. And this is precisely what we have seen in months, that the war spilled over, that you had an involvement, so-called axis of resistance, with the attacks by, well, sporadic attacks by some smaller groups out of Iraq, and then obviously Hezbollah, who's also firing missiles, artillery, drones, and whatnot, and Israel basically ever since October 8th in Israel, of course, retaliating. So I think it's a very complex situation. It's a very messy situation, and I'm afraid that it's only going to get worse in the coming weeks.
I understand. And just recently, actually, the United States, they have carried out bombing of Houthi positions in Yemen with the I forgot exactly the name of those bombs, but they're like a piercing bombs that actually aim to destroy, you know, the underground facilities that the terrorists these groups may be having their weapons stored, or their positions, etc., etc. And Richard, actually, the same question goes to you. Could you please maybe describe in a few words, in a few sentences, how do you see the current situation in the Middle East, and where exactly are we heading regarding the growing fears of, let's say, a bigger war between Iran and Israel?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. This is an important question because we have to remember that Middle East was always kind of a hot spot, and a lot of wars took place in this area, and a lot of hostilities were traded almost all the time since the end of the Second World War. So each time was uneasy for especially for inhabitants of this region. But we have to understand that this terrorist attack of October the 7th, I can compare it, I think, easily with the 9/11 attack on the United States from the Al-Qaeda side, because I think that here we have some kind of two similarities. First of all, the scale of this attack was a complete surprise for the attacked side. Yes, the United States was completely and absolutely shocked by what happened on 9/11, and the same happened in Israel actually on the 7th of October. And the second similarity is that I think that the perpetrators probably did not reckon the possible outcome and consequences of this kind of attack due to the scale. And I do not think that they were quite well aware of the consequences which were taking place and now are taking place as a result of these terrorist attacks. And of course, I think that the main question is this kind of retaliation you mentioned just before. I'm meaning retaliation of Israel against Iran. How strong it's going to be, because I think that there is no question that it is the matter of when rather than if. Most commentators, at least, they are expecting it, and I'm belonging to this group of commentators which are also expecting some kind of revenge from the Israeli side. But the question is the scale of this revenge, whether it is going to be so-called de-escalating, that means showing some strength and showing that they have ability to strike on the territory of Iran, or is it going to escalate the whole situation? So the scale of this counterattack might be even stronger and hard to imagine now among the experts. And of course, it depends. If it is going to de-escalate, maybe Iran is going to at least withdraw for some moment. But if it is going to escalate the situation, I think that there is another question, what Iran will do in case of such a devastating attack on facilities, Iranian facilities, particularly the nuclear facilities in Iran.
Exactly, and from what I was able to read recently, the different experts, I mean, mostly Western experts, they agree, and maybe you will share this opinion or you will contradict it. But I would like also to know your to know your opinion about it. So I've recently read that different foreign experts, they say that right now, given that the Israeli managed to eradicate the let's say Hezbollah leaders and even the possible leaders after the Hassan Nasrallah death, and the operations in the Gaza and the eradication of hundreds of terrorists from Hamas, so that Iran basically has nothing to do instead except for going basically nuclear. And the question is right now whether Israel will try to sabotage or attack directly the Iranian nuclear facilities. That's the question. And another issue that we know, that the United States are currently, let's say, trying to calm down the possible Israeli support, and at the same time the elections, they are like they're happening right now in the United States at this very moment, and will end on 9th of November, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, at the beginning of November. So what do you think about it? Will Israelis will wait the outcome of the U.S. elections, or will they try to strike or carry out a strike on Iran before this? I know it's you don't have a crystal ball, but in your opinion, what would be smarter for them to do?
Where do you want to go? Actually, I can say something to it.
Yes, yes, please.
I mean, I was just thinking, yeah, it is a bit of a crystal ball question. I mean, you also hear a lot of different takes on what they will actually attack. You already mentioned the nuclear facilities. There was talk about energy facilities such as oil fields. So some people even suggest that they might take out, Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of Iran, which I would not think that plausible, because I think there's still a bit of a difference whether you leader of a non-state actor or state actor, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas, or whether then you kill the leader of the country. I mean, you may like it, but Iran is an internationally recognized government, and I think this would be a very escalating step. I think something also to keep in mind that actually Israel has somewhat limited options to carry out this. What I mean by that, of course, they can attack, but for example, they don't have the same capability of surface to surface ballistic missiles as Iran does. For example, also, at least to the best of our knowledge, drones with that kind of range that Iran used in the past, and they attack cruise missiles. So what we heard, at least from this lead, suggests that they're carrying some airplanes, like combat airplanes with air-launched ballistic missiles, but presumably this will be a relatively small number. So what I would think is probably likely that they're going to attack some more or less symbolic targets again. This could be, for example, military equipment close to those nuclear facilities, similar in the way that they did in April, which is basically to send a signal, right? It's to say, look, we're able to hit you where it really hurts. We're not doing it at the really grand scale yet, but if we want to, we'll be easily able to do that. But as to the moment when they're going to carry out these attacks, I have no idea, frankly. I don't want to speculate.
Sure. Anyway, obviously. And Richard, do you have something to add to this, or you prefer to go to another question?
Yes, I may add something, because foreseeing the future is, of course, very difficult, as we know from Niels Bohr, for example, for quite a long time. But just to make our conversation more interesting, I maybe just try to deliberate on the question of more severe attack on Iranian facilities, because what Michael was saying just now was this scenario of de-escalating the conflict, yes, of just showing the strength, but not destroying so much that Iran has to retaliate, and this vicious circle of conflict might burst out inevitably. But I don't know, because it is based on the interest of Israel, and of course how this interest of Israel are perceived by the current government, which of course is also involved in infighting inside Israel. And of course, it might be charged of an attempt to affect United States elections, because a huge strike before elections definitely will influence, maybe to some extent decisively, the voting and the will of the American nation. So, considering the time frame of attack, I think that Israelis will be wise enough to wait till the elections and to do whatever they want to do later, just not to be accused of this kind of influence games. But I do know I'm afraid of a quite severe response, because Israeli leaders, and not only leaders from the political side, but also intelligence heads and military commanders were saying that they will not allow Iran to develop nuclear capabilities. And unfortunately, you are completely right what you were saying. Hezbollah is gone for some time, of course. Hamas is also out of game for some time, and probably maybe the regime in Iran will go in this direction, like you mentioned before, that they will going to speed up the development of the nuclear capabilities. So maybe this is a kind of a threat. And if they are going to attack directly with some kind of huge force, it might be a huge escalation of the situation in the whole Middle East, because Iran had to be will be responsible for some kind of retaliation on the other side.
Exactly, and the question that I always preoccupies me, let's say, is that the world after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and after the 2022, the world is going, at least how I see it, the world is really going into two blocks. So the West is crystallizing even more, and then at the same time we have such countries like Iran, Russia, China that is playing its own game actually. And by the way, we all remember that the Chinese have facilitated the rapprochement, as we say, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And just recently I've read that Saudis and Iranians will be hosting joint naval drills So it seems like more cooperation happens within the so-called the other world, while the West is also consolidating somehow. So, but let's actually jump about to the question about the terrorist organizations and Iran use of proxies, because as we know, Iran is very interesting country that relied during very long time on proxies to advance its foreign policy agenda mostly. And I would like you to try to explain, maybe from the Iranian point of view, or if you have other cases maybe of other countries using the proxies or terrorist organizations in order to advance their foreign agenda and their interests abroad. And I'd also like you to maybe try to speculate a bit. How do you see, or maybe who do you see may replace, for example, Hamas and Hezbollah for Iran? What kind of organization may be or may evolve since the dismantlement of the heads of Hamas and Hezbollah, respectively? And we all remember that Houthis as well receive very important support from the Iranians. So I would like to continue with you, Richard, on this, if you understood clearly my question, or if you would like me to reformulate it.
Well, I hope so. Well, there are a couple of things, I think, to deal with. First of all, the situation of the use of proxies by Iran. Well, it is well known that Hezbollah was established with a huge amount of support, not only political but also military, with kind of a training and providing some intelligence from the Iranian side. And from time to time, other such groups were also used by Iran to achieve their own goals in foreign policy and to build this kind of a Shia bloc, yes, in the Middle East, as it is usually Shia triangle, as it is usually described in the Middle East. And they were pretty successful in achieving this. Till the last couple of weeks, Hezbollah was a kind of a story of success in the Middle East. It was a very kind of influential organization, not only on the level of the military capabilities, but including the political life in Lebanon and also out of Lebanon, because they were having the reach also to Africa and to Southern America as well. So I think that Iran is not going to cease this kind of attempt to build or rebuild such entities on place, or just using the remnants of what is now available for these groups to rebuild their position, but it's also going to take time. So this is the first case. The second case, considering the use of proxies by other state entities. Of course, I'm not going to not to mention Russia, because Russia is very well known of using this type, but of course maybe less overt. Yes, they are somewhere there. And of course, intelligence agencies probably are having more accurate information about how they are using these proxies. But definitely, considering, for example, the situation in Poland, we have 2 days ago, the foreign minister informed that we are simply closing the consulate of Russia in Poznań, as a kind of a hub for spying operations, but these spying operations included not only some kind of typical intelligence operations, but also sabotaging some places, and it was really kind of a very huge problem dissolved by the Polish Internal Security Agency. So definitely Russia is the second state subject which is using proxies in quite extensive way, I guess. And the last thing you asked us to speculate, well,
a bit.
Yes. Well, I think, of course, Hezbollah and Hamas are not gone completely, but definitely they are disbanded to much degree, and they are going to seek for new kind of leaders. But I do not expect that these new leaders, probably younger, are going to be less threatening than the previous generation. So I think that if the ashes of war are going to get down, I think that from the ashes, some structures of similar organizations are going to emerge with a huge support from Iranian side.
I understand. And Michel, do you have something to say about it?
Yeah, I'm very happy to jump in. I mean, you know, when I'm
please do.
When I'm not teaching and researching at the military academy, I'm still a PhD candidate myself, and actually my thesis is about proxy warfare. So this is a topic that have been researching for a couple of years, and basically one of the arguments that I'm making in my thesis obviously needs some theoretical model, right? So one thing that I'm arguing that is there are kind of different rationales, or you can call it strategic approaches to proxy warfare. And so I would actually argue that a lot of, you know, actors and state actors are using proxy warfare, and not just like Russia and Iran, but for example, also if you think about the US in Syria, for example, working with Syrian Kurds. Now, of course, they don't like to call that proxy warfare because it's not a very popular term. So they will call it buy with through or security assistance, capacity building, whatever you want to call it. But it's still the same principle, right? Because you work through another actor on the ground. You may give them some air power, some air support, some other kinds of support, but it's the same thing. But so what I'm trying to argue in my thesis is that there are different rationales. And I basically describe three overriding rationales. The first one is sort of the thing that we had during the Cold War, which is really based on risk management, escalation management, right? Because you don't want a conflict to go nuclear. That's reason number one. Then the second one I would argue is what you maybe want to call expediency or cost efficiency, and it's really about you don't want to have the burden and all the costs associated with warfare, which of course is direct costs, worst cost a lot of money, but also like the
human costs.
Yeah, human costs, exactly. But even like indirect political costs, for example, like the threshold to actually wage war can be pretty high. And so if you can do an off-the-books operation instead, you have fewer political costs and you might not lose an election. Whereas if you send your own troops and a lot of them die, not so great politically. So this is the second rationale, which I would argue has been guiding a lot of U.S. engagement throughout the Middle East over the last years. And then when it comes to Iranians, I would actually call it capability substitution. Because the fact of the matter is that they don't really have a lot of conventional military capabilities, right? When we talk about military power in the sense of conventional power projection, we typically think of Air Force carriers strike like the Americans have. Iranians don't have that. So instead, what they're doing is they're relying on their network of proxies all across the region, which of course it is an advantage and it's actually quite useful for them. But I think still at the same time, it's also a sign that they are not as powerful as compared to other states, at least in terms of conventional military capabilities. And then I would also argue that it's very important if we're looking at that is if you look at those. Also, first another point to make, which I think is really important because I'm very often getting into this debate, but proxy isn't it an absurd model because it assumes that those actors, those non-state armed groups, they're just puppets. No, of course not. They're not puppets. And I would argue that actually none of the groups that we call proxies in this world actually consider themselves to be proxies. They have their own agendas. They have their own freedom of action. I think this is always very important to consider. But the point that I want to make here is that if you look at those groups that are aligned with Iran one way or another, we see very different parameters, we can call it, in terms of their dependency on Iran, but also the autonomy that they have, the freedom of action that they have. You have some groups like Iran, for example, also used to recruit Shia minorities in Pakistan and Afghanistan to fight in Syria, and these are also proxy groups, and they're very reliant on Iran. I mean, they don't have a lot of freedom of action. They really just do what Iran wants them to do. But then, of course, a group such as Hezbollah has started out as a proxy, and I would argue there still very much are an Iranian proxy, but over time they have gotten some freedom of action. And also, if you look at Hamas, for example, I think that's yet another category, not just because they're not Shia, they're clearly aligned with Iran, but if you look at, for example, also the history of the last 10, 15 years, I mean, Iran and Hamas were on different sides. For Syria, for example, I mean, Hamas really they moved their headquarters out of Syria for that reason, that they had some very strange relations with Iran for a couple of years in these Afghan territory. And So I think these are the first two parts, and then also a little bit of speculation. So I think Richard is totally right. They are down, but they're not out. I think Hamas definitely their military potential is massively big because you have Israel controlling at least partially a lot of the Gaza Strip at the moment. If we're looking at the region or at the border region in Lebanon right now, things get much murkier. I mean, I don't know exactly, how far the Israelis advanced. I think there's a lot of censorship going on. The Israelis are actually quite good at military censorship. I'm time and again impressed again how they can control information. And I would argue that at least as long as you don't, put boots on the ground in the Bekaa Valley, which is really this heartland, it's further to the north, right, northeastern part of Lebanon. And I would argue that Hezbollah probably still has a lot of military capabilities there, so they're not out at all. But then, of course, yes, you have the Houthi that probably have become closer to Iran over the last 10 years, and they show a lot of capabilities. I mean, I still remember it was almost a year ago now, a little bit less, when they boarded the first ship, right, that they kidnapped. I think it was the Galaxy leader, and I saw them, this landing with the helicopter. I couldn't believe it at first. And I said, "What? That's the Houthis? That's crazy." Yeah, so that's so much for that.
That's true. Thank you for your very interesting input and mentioning your thesis. By the way, when will it be ready? Do you know? Do you have a date?
Well, I mean, working 100% and at the same time writing your thesis is a very bad proposition. I will really not recommend.
I know. I feel you.
I know.
I feel you on this. Actually, just recently, I mean, not so recently, but maybe like it was beginning of October. I was in Poland, in Warsaw, by the way, and I've seen the news, and there was the how do you call it, attempt to attack on Israeli embassy. It was an attack against Israeli embassy following the Israeli strikes against Hezbollah. And right now, 2 days ago, a Libyan was arrested in Germany on suspicion of planning yet again an attack against an Israeli embassy. So my question is that, given that the European Union, especially Western Europe, we have different people living in here, citizens or migrants from the Middle Eastern countries, from the Northern African countries, different Muslim groups. In your opinion, how this conflict, or actually these conflicts in plural, in the Middle East may threaten the security situation, mostly in Western European countries, with regard to the terrorist threat? Can we link somehow the destabilization or worsening of situation in the Middle East with the more probabilities of terrorist attacks in, for example, in France, in Germany, and in other countries, especially given that we have seen already an attack against an Israeli embassy, and another guy who was arrested on suspicion of planning such an attack. And I also asked Richard later about Poland, how the situation is in Poland, because I know that, at least if I'm not mistaken, Poland is the only country, or one of the few countries in the European Union that have never had actually an Islamist terrorist act. Maybe I'm mistaken, so you will correct me later. But I will start with you, Michel.
I mean, I will mostly defer to Richard afterwards because he's the expert on terrorism. But so at least the sense that I'm getting is that, first of all, absolutely, the threat level probably all across Europe and slightly all across the world has increased massively. Because I think, also for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously, the war in Gaza is a rallying cry, or you can use it as a rallying cry to mobilize emotions, to mobilize, especially also lone actors to carry out such attacks. I mean, it's very obvious that you have approximate cost that you can use to justify an attack. Anyway, will make use of it. I mean, we saw the same thing when Islamic State was still real, right? When you still had the so-called caliphate. I think at least at the time we had more attackers than we had period afterwards. And I think this, at the very least, can serve as a rallying cry. But then I think also that the threat level is, or the threat is actually quite diverse, because on one hand you have lone attackers, but you have all across Europe. It's also well known that you have Hezbollah networks. And we also know that, for example, in the past, I mean, Israel and Iran, they have waged a shadow war against each other for a couple of years or even decades. I think especially around 2010s to 11, 12, there was also a campaign going all across Europe where Israel and Iran tried to carry out attacks. Most of them actually failed. We had the attack in Burgas, obviously, that was successful. I think it was the only really successful at the time. This was in the context of Iranian nuclear scientists getting assassinated in Iran. So you have this threat, definitely. And I would also say that under certain circumstances, we could see another wave of that, of Iran or Hezbollah trying to carry out acts of terrorism. And most likely, obviously against Israeli embassies, they are a very logical target, but probably also against Jewish community centers, for example. This would be another, for them, logical target, and maybe even less hardened Israeli embassies. And I would also argue, not just in Europe, obviously, I think we also just heard that there were some warnings about attacks in Sri Lanka, for example, and I can imagine other parts of the world that threat levels have also gone up. Because from what I know, Iran and Hezbollah, they also have been very pragmatic when it comes to that. They work together with even secular people that might just, be in it for monetary reasons to carry out attacks like that, and they will absolutely weaponize them.
I understand. Thank you. And Richard, your input, and especially the case of Poland's uniqueness.
Yeah, it's not Poland is not so unique as everybody tend to think, I guess. But of course, I can agree absolutely with Michael with this assessment that the situation is deteriorating and is having influence. What is happening in the Middle East definitely influences what is happening in Europe, but not also in Europe. We have to remember, for example, these two huge terrorist attacks in 1992, 1994, made by Iran, actually with accomplices from Hezbollah in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So, of course, not only Europe, but I guess each place like Sri Lanka or maybe Indonesia or any place where you have synagogues, cultural places when Jews might attend, and of course, embassies is threatened by this way. But going back to this question of Poland, just to provide you with some facts, we did not really have some kind of a successful terrorist attack on Polish soil.
I was right.
Yes, so you were right, but we had quite a lot of unsuccessful attempts of developing terrorist activity, because terrorist activity is not only actually making terrorist attacks, yes, but also to provide some ground for some kind of cells and structures of terrorist groups in some places, just to support other structures. So we observed it definitely, and in Poland we had some cases of such situations. As far as I know, we also had some kind of attempts of terrorist attacks in Poland, also from some kind of Islamist groups, but fortunately they were not successful, and they were thwarted by Polish internal intelligence services. So this is the good side. The bad side is that, of course, when you want to develop some kind of a terrorist infrastructure, you need to have some kind of a social milieu. And this social milieu, which was absent, let's say, 20 years ago in Poland, now it is visible, because Poland today is a completely different country than Poland 10 or even 20 years ago, as you probably seen when you visited our country.
Yes.
We have quite a lot of immigrants, as each Western country, and this social milieu is just being created. So I think that the developments might be really, really threatening, because we may just just have this kind of social milieu which might be used by terrorist structures. The second thing is also that the situation, well, especially among young people are following the events, yes, and we can divide radicalization into two parts: light radicalization and hard radicalization. Hard radicalization is leading to terrorist acts, yes, but we also have light radicalization, protests, somehow some kind of symbolic actions, and these are currently taking place in Poland, in many universities, for example. This is close to my interest, of course, because I'm from the university.
Like in France.
Yes, we had places of protests. There are some kind of occupations even of some places. And the theme is also the Middle East, not only some kind of a social problems of students, but what is actually happening in the Middle East and these hostile actions of Israel against the civilians in the Gaza Strip. So definitely the problem is growing, and I do not neglect it, definitely. I think that we should expect rather the deterioration of the situation than something which might be more optimistic from this point of view. So we have to be ready. We have to be ready.
It is quite worrying, actually, but it is interesting that you have highlighted the protests at the universities, because I was not aware of it, but I know that in France we have had different rallies in support of Palestine, and some more radicalized rallies who were supporting even Hamas actions against Israel.
I may add that these people are also ethnic Poles, yes, if I may use this kind of description. They are not foreigners, they are not immigrants, they are people who were born here and their fathers were living here, so on and so on. But they are involved in politics, and they are going to this kind of light, soft radicalization process.
Michel, and do we observe? Yes,
I think you want to ask me about Switzerland, right?
Yes, exactly. And I wanted to ask you, how is it going?
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, how's it going? I mean, not well. No, I mean, it could be worse. That's probably the right thing to say. But yeah, of course, we also had those protests. It's interesting. Just I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, our Federal Intelligence Service released their annual security assessment, or SITREP, basically. And they obviously also talked about this, about the issue of jihadist radicalization. They actually observed that it increased again over the last couple of years. Like, the situation has gotten worse again ever since in the Gaza and between Israel and Hamas started. They also talked, for example, about this Hezbollah net. Even have Switzerland, I think they said it's like a couple of thousand people, and they don't say that they're actively planning attacks, which I also don't think would be the case in Switzerland at the moment. But at least there's a possibility. And then, of course, yes, we also had a protest at the universities, which was to be expected, I guess. And I think what's here, not to make it too dramatic or whatever, but I think also when you look at it historically, what can happen, I agree with what Richard said about the difference between hard radicalization and soft radicalization. It's interesting to see, of course, that some of the hardcore groups after that, they sort of came out of this milieu of soft radicalization, right? Some of the most famous or infamous, probably is the better description. Terrorist groups, they emerged out of student protests and student movement. So I guess this is something that the security services most definitely will keep an eye on. And I mean, maybe what's also interesting, I think, compared to many of our neighbors, we got rather lucky with jihadist attacks in Switzerland in the past. We have the milieu. We also have, I think, actually, in comparison, we had a relatively high number, relatively speaking, of foreign travelers, of people who traveled to Iraq or Syria to either join the Islamic State or, in some cases, also Al-Qaeda. And we got very lucky so far with attacks. And the problem is sometimes, right, you don't really know how much was just pure luck, or how much was also being averted by security services, because they don't always tell you what they actually were able to. Yeah, I mean, this is also something, because we're talking about intelligence failures a lot, but that's one of the problems. We only always see the failures. We don't look at these successes, which also are used in time. I would also say, on an optimistic note, I think intelligence cooperation when it comes to jihadist actors has gotten much better in Europe the last couple of years.
In Europe or globally, you would say?
Yeah, probably also globally, 100%. But I think also specifically in Europe, because I remember, let's say, 10 years ago or so, there was not a lot of sharing of information. I mean, it was very obvious at the time. And every time there was an attack, everyone, said, now we really need to start sharing information. And then it went a couple of months, another attack in the same reference basically started again. Now we really need to share information. And at least my sense is this has really gotten better over the last couple of years. I don't know, whether it will change again, but I think we've made some progress.
And it's definitely a very positive note. And I guess I'd like to ask you the last question for this passionate discussion, where we were actually jumping from the proxies to terrorist attacks, but it's all related. And in your opinion, actually, what kind of strategies the West or Europe, if you want, the European countries could undertake to mitigate terrorist threats? Because there are different opinions, and some say we have to, more politically oriented ideas is that we have to better control the borders, to decrease immigration, etc. But in your opinion, what kind of policies and strategies we could be eyeing? And I will start with Richard, and I will end with you, Michel.
Well, this is probably the most tricky question today.
Exactly. Well, maybe you could also give examples how Poland is trying to mitigate the terrorist threats. What kind of policies exist in your country, for example?
Well, basically, as you probably know, we have a huge security problem, which is kind of predates aggression on Ukraine. On the 24th of February 2022, it was this influx of immigrants from Belarus to Poland, because it was a couple of months earlier when we were, to say, attacked, yes, by the Belarusian side with demographic bomb. Some people, immigrant bomb, some people are describing it in this way. And of course, well, the only thing we could do actually was to build the fence, yes, to put it in a slogan way. But actually it served the purpose. We stopped this uncontrolled influx of people, but of course not 100%, because it's simply impossible. We have quite a long border, and of course it is not possible to...
And very hostile neighbors.
Yes, very hostile. On the other side, these people are of course used and supported by the security services of the Lukashenko's regime. So definitely from this point of view, it was a huge problem, but I think that we at least mildly saying, well, managed to get to the grip with this, and to at least to limit the influence of this kind of aggression, to put it in this way. Mm-hmm. But of course, well, the terrorist groups are infiltrated by the internal intelligence, and I think that they are doing quite well their jobs, and they perform pretty well so far, as you see. Well, the ultimate test of terrorist capabilities, whether they are successful in attacking a country or not, whether they are trying to do it. Yes, so far Poland is on the winning side, but of course we can expect change anytime. But definitely, of course, when we are talking about some kind of a European cooperation, I think that this is the most important. First of all, we need to share intelligence, as it was mentioned before, because it is crucial. We were many times informed by our allies about the possibilities of some kind of rogue activity on our territory. And of course, we are very grateful for this, and we're trying to repay these debts. But of course, I think that the question of constructing some kind of a pan-European strategy of dealing with these problems is very difficult from a political point of view, because we have so many perceptions of the problem, we have so many disagreements, we have so many interests involved in it, that now I am a bit pessimistic about it. Yes, I think that some kind of bilateral cooperation might be more useful than some kind putting it on the ground of a Brussels level, I guess. This is my hint.
And just a quick follow-up question for you. Don't you think, or how do you think, naming or labeling this or that terrorist organization as terrorist, because there is a list of terrorist organizations, there is a European Union list, and United Nations list. I mean, there are different countries even have their own lists of terrorist organizations. Does it really help? Because, for example, within the European Union, if I'm not mistaken, Austria named Muslims Brotherhood as terrorist organization. But I mean, speaking of Hamas and others and other smaller groups and organizations, would it actually help to have them in the list? And basically, would it really help to combat them better, having them on the list? Or it's just a bureaucracy that don't really serve the cause?
Well, I would not dare to say that this bureaucratic work is not important, because first of all, you need to have some kind of a lawful background of developing some kind of bureaucratic actions, like, for example, for the border guard. Yes, you need to have a state is not a lawless kind of entity, and it has to be supported by some kind of a bureaucratic action. So definitely, I don't want to say that this is completely not important, because it is. It helps. For example, it's giving us a hint. Yes, what we should consider as a kind of a hostile organization, but definitely it is not a golden bullet. Definitely, other kind of approaches must be applied to deal with this kind of a threat.
I understand. And so the same question to you, Michel, and strategies that the West could undertake to mitigate terrorist threats, and this follow-up question as well about the naming the terrorists and putting them into a terrorist list. Does it help or not?
I think I'm going to start with the second question, actually, because it's quite interesting. So Switzerland, until now, actually, we had a very simple policy, which was to just take the UN list of prescribed terrorist organizations, which were basically two, right? It was Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and all their allies. Now there has been a push, and I think it's actually in the works right now to also designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. And there's, from what I understand, there's now already some work to be done, or at least some politicians push also to do that for Hezbollah. I think it can have some benefits, right? Because you can, for example, of course, you can also interdict, or you can prescribe certain activities that might not be covered as long as those groups are not, considered terrorist organizations. Or you can also, for example, make it harder for sympathizers to rally to their cause and whatnot. What for me always was a bit of a question is whether doing that cannot also open the box of Pandora. So, for example, that you will have, once you designate one of those other groups that are not on the UN list, then all of a sudden a lot of countries will come to you and also say, well, that's nice that you did that, but actually now we, Turkey, for example, we also want you to prescribe PKK, for example, Kurdish Workers' Party. Or you're going to have Sri Lanka coming and maybe say, well, the Tamil Tigers are not that big of a problem anymore, but maybe just, to be sure, maybe you should also prescribe them. And this probably can turn into a bureaucratic headache. So there's pluses and there's minuses, and thank God I don't need to make those decisions, and I can just opine on them, which is much easier, right? No, sure. And then generally speaking of strategy, yeah, again, I already mentioned it before. I think intelligence sharing is a huge part, and we're in the same position as Poland when it comes to that. We've benefited hugely from some of our partners, specifically France, and thank you, France. And also the United States, because our options, at least from what we read in the newspapers and hear in the media, they're quite restricted compared to other countries. What we can do online, for example. And I mean, then of course I think also the problem is, right, there's no one size fits all approach. I mean, what I found quite interesting is that I think the euphoria that we had maybe also 10 years ago about all those de-radicalization programs and, preventing violent extremism and whatnot, a lot of them seems to have gone, namely for good reason, because there were a lot of charlatans that, set up all kinds of programs that sounded great on paper. And I mean, basically every government in Europe thought, oh my goodness, now we need a strategy for de-radicalization. Let's just hire this expert and that consultant. And I think a lot of it wasn't all that useful. But that being said, I think in some countries, it's definitely also important to try to, at least if you have communities that that are, or you have minorities that are discriminated or they feel discriminated. I'm not saying whether this is true or not, whether it is being discriminated or not, but you probably should still try to take a look at what is going on there, and are there ways to at least build some relations with these communities, and also, for example, at least get them to the point where if they can actually uncover activities in their midst, that they will actually help you and inform you, not just turn a blind eye on it. That's a problem. But again, I think this really is very different from one country to another in that regard. For example, Switzerland is quite lucky. I think we don't have the social issues that have in other countries. I mean, France, looking at you, we obviously have huge issues, the same thing with Belgium, for example. The so-called banlieues, or really those. I mean, you have neighborhoods where basically sometimes apparently even police doesn't really want to be all too present anymore. It's a huge headache. We don't have that in Switzerland. So I think these are obviously also
You're lucky.
issues. Yeah, no, but these are issues probably at the European level that need to be addressed as well. So I guess you will probably need a multi-pronged approach that includes both law enforcement, intelligence, and maybe also social work, social aid to elevate the situation wherever possible. But again, I think one size fits all just won't work, and every country needs to take a hard look and see how they can best address this themselves.
Sure. And on this note, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your inputs. You're very, very good and actually strong experts, I would say, solid experts in your respective areas. And Richard, I will be also happy to be joining you next month.
Yes.
For that panel we have discussed. So thank you very much, and also please don't hesitate, exchange your contacts, and stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.